The boardroom smelled the way it always did: coffee, old carpet, and the particular kind of tension that comes before a storm. I had been in that room 100 times. I had sat at that table since I was 12 years old, watching my father run meetings, learning the rhythms of Okafor construction from the inside. I thought I knew what this meeting was about. A new contract, maybe. The Abuja Road project we had been preparing for. I straightened my jacket and opened my notebook. There were 11 people in the room. Family members, senior staff, 2 outside consultants. My brother Chidi sat at the far end of the table, his expression already arranged into something I could not quite read. My father stood at the head. He did not sit down. He looked around the room once, slowly, the way he always did before a significant announcement. Then he looked directly at me. "Effective today," he said, his voice carrying the same steady weight it had always carried. "Tebena will no longer hold a position in this company." The room went perfectly, completely silent. I heard someone's chair shift. I heard a pen drop. I looked at my father's face and found nothing there I recognized. No one spoke. Not immediately. The silence stretched for what felt like a full minute, pressing against every wall of that room. I was aware of faces turning toward me, some with shock, some with careful blankness, 1 or 2 with the particular alertness of people storing information to repeat later. My father was still standing. He had not looked away from me, and Chidi, at the far end of the table, had allowed the smallest smile to cross his face. He caught himself and flattened it, but I had already seen it. I understood then that this had not been decided this morning. It had been decided some time ago. My notebook was still open in front of me. I closed it slowly. I picked up my pen and placed it in my chest pocket. I pushed back my chair. The scraping sound was very loud in the quiet room. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked at my father for one long moment. He held my gaze. I did not speak. There was nothing to say that the room could be trusted with. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the corridor. Behind me, I heard the meeting resume. The door closed. I kept walking. I sat in my car in the company parking lot for 40 minutes without starting the engine. The building I had grown up inside stood in front of me, 5 floors of glass and pale stone my grandfather had built from nothing, that my father had doubled in size, that I had spent 8 years working to deserve. I was 31 years old. I had a degree in civil engineering and a postgraduate certificate in construction management. I had brought in 4 of the company's last 6 major contracts. I knew where every crack in that building was literally and structurally, and I had just been removed from it in front of 11 witnesses, without a single private conversation first. The thing I kept returning to was not the humiliation, though the humiliation was real. It was the pattern. My father had done versions of this before, not this publicly, not this finally, but the shape of it was familiar. Chidi had always been louder, more aggressive, more willing to flatter. I had always been more careful, more methodical. My father had mistaken my quietness for weakness. I started the engine. I knew what I was not going to do. I was not going back to beg. My phone started ringing before I reached the end of the street. My Aunt Ngozi first, then 2 cousins, then someone from accounts whose name I barely knew. I let them all go to voicemail. The calls told me the information was already moving, out of the boardroom into corridors onto phones. By evening, it would be in the family group chats. By morning, it would have reached people my father never intended to tell. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I didn't drink. I was not going to call my father. I was not going to send a message demanding an explanation. I was not going to show up at the house and make a scene that would let him reframe me as unstable, which was exactly what a scene would do. What I was going to do was think. I had spent 8 years building knowledge of Okafor construction from the inside. I knew its clients, its suppliers, its weaknesses, its debts. I knew things about the company's structure that Chidi had never bothered to learn because he assumed it would simply be handed to him. I opened my laptop, found the company charter, and started reading again more carefully. The charter had a clause I had noticed before, but never examined closely. It concerned the rights of founding family members who held a certain class of shares my grandfather had issued when he first registered the company, distributed to his children and, upon their deaths, to their direct descendants. My father held the majority, but a small percentage, never discussed, had passed to me when my mother died 3 years ago. She had been my grandfather's youngest daughter. Her shares had gone quietly into my name because no one had thought to remove them, and my father had not expected them to matter. Under the charter, a shareholder above a specific threshold had the right to request a formal accounting of company decisions. It was a dry, technical clause. It had probably never been used in the company's entire history. But it was there, valid, and it meant my removal could be contested, not emotionally, not in a family meeting, but through the proper legal structure of the company itself. I did not pick up the phone and call a lawyer that night. I wrote down the clause number, the page, and the exact wording. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. The first move was information. Everything else could wait. My father made his public announcement 4 days later. He called a press conference and announced a major expansion. New offices in 3 cities. A bid for a federal infrastructure contract worth more than anything the company had ever attempted. Chitty stood beside him in a new suit, photographed nodding and smiling. I read the coverage online from my apartment. The plan was bold. It was also, in several specific ways I could identify immediately, dangerously overextended. The company did not have the cash reserves the simultaneous costs would require. 2 of the 3 new office locations were in markets with no established relationships. The federal contract bid required a track record in a specific category of civil works that Okafor had only partial experience with. I had raised concerns about an earlier version of this plan 8 months ago. My father had dismissed them. Chitty had called my concerns overly cautious, which was his word for careful. I pulled up a notebook and started writing down exactly where I believed the plan would fail and approximately when. Not because I was going to do anything with the analysis yet, but because a man who plans ahead writes things down. My former mentor was a man named Balagan Adeyemi. He had been my father's business partner in the early years, before a disagreement separated them. He had built his own firm, smaller than Okafor but consistently profitable, respected for taking on difficult projects and finishing them correctly. I had maintained a relationship with him quietly, meeting every few months, learning from someone who had known my father when my father was still making mistakes. I called him the week after the boardroom meeting. I told him what had happened without drama, just the facts. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this call for about 2 years." He told me to come to his office on Friday. He told me to bring everything I knew about Okafor's current client relationships, specifically any clients who had expressed dissatisfaction in the last 18 months. I had 3 names in my head before he finished the sentence. I said I would be there. After the call, I sat in my car and felt, for the first time since the boardroom, something other than numbness. It was not hope exactly. It was the specific feeling of a door opening. I registered a new business entity on a Wednesday afternoon. The process took less than 2 hours at the Corporate Affairs Commission. I chose a name that was professional and contained nothing connecting it to my family, Solid Base Infrastructure Limited. It was a modest name for a modest operation, a registered company with 1 director, no staff, no contracts. But it existed on paper, which meant it could exist in the world. Balagan advised me to keep it quiet for as long as possible. His involvement would be advisory, entirely private. His value was not his name but his network, 30 years of relationships with suppliers, contractors, and clients who trusted his judgment. The first thing he did was make 3 calls on my behalf. A week later, I received a message from a procurement director at a mid-sized real estate firm. His name was Emeka Osei. He said a mutual contact had suggested I might be interested in a discussion about an upcoming project. I replied the same afternoon. I was careful about my tone. Professional, interested, unhurried. Not desperate. Desperate is a smell that people in business detect from across a room. I had learned that lesson watching other people make that mistake. 3 months after the boardroom, Solid Base had its first signed contract. A foundation and drainage system for a residential development outside Lagos. Not large, but real, funded, and mine. I managed it personally, spending time on site in the early mornings, learning the soil conditions, the drainage patterns after rain, the preferences of the site foreman who had more practical knowledge than most engineers I had met in offices. The work was good. I knew it was good because the foreman told me so, and he was a man who did not give compliments he did not mean. Word in construction travels quietly, not through press releases, but through the observations of people who notice which projects are delivered on time. By the end of the first contract, 2 other developers had contacted me. I had not advertised. The work had spoken before I could. Meanwhile, through a contact still at Okafor, I received word that Chitty had handled a client meeting badly. The client had asked technical questions Chitty could not answer. The meeting ended without a signature considered certain. Something was shifting, quietly, in a direction no one had yet named aloud. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. My father's expansion ambitions were producing the results I had calculated. The federal contract bid hit a qualification problem in the 3rd month of the procurement process. Okafor's track record in the required civil works category was reviewed by the evaluation committee and found to be incomplete. The bid was not disqualified outright, but placed on a secondary review track, which in federal procurement language means effectively stalled. I knew this because one of the consultants at the boardroom meeting called me to share the information. He did not explain why he was telling me. He simply told me, with a care in his voice that suggested he had been watching and had formed his own conclusions. I thanked him and said nothing further. What I did not say was that I had predicted this specific outcome 8 months ago when my concerns had been dismissed as overly cautious. I did not say it because it would have felt like a performance of victory, and I was not interested in performing. I was interested in building. But I wrote down the date in my notebook, as I had written down everything since the day I left that parking lot. Chitty found out about Solid Base in the 5th month. His first response was what I had expected. He contacted 2 of my suppliers and implied, without stating it directly, that doing business with me carried risks, that my departure from Okafor had been for reasons reflecting on my character, that I was involved in a dispute that might cause legal complications. It was clumsy. The suppliers he contacted were people I had worked with for years, people who had watched me on construction sites at 6 in the morning, people who had seen me solve problems rather than redirect blame. One called me directly to report what had happened. I thought you should know, he said. I told him I had no concerns. I thanked him. I considered what to do with the information. I could have called people, corrected the narrative, defended myself. Instead, I called Emeka Ose and asked about any upcoming projects requiring a reliable foundation specialist. He mentioned one immediately. I submitted a proposal the following week. Chitty's attempt to undermine me had, by occupying his attention, kept him from doing something more dangerous. Sometimes your opponent's move is most useful as a distraction from your own. I had a rule during those months. I would not speak about my father or Chitty or Okafor in any professional conversation. Not to complain, not to explain, not to provide context. If someone asked why I had left the company, I said only that I had decided to build something of my own. People who knew the industry understood that answer. The rule kept me clean. It kept my professional relationships from becoming entangled in a family story that would only distract from the quality of the work. Everything people heard about me, suppliers, clients, contractors, they heard from observing Solid Base directly, not from my account of myself. Meanwhile, my father's public expansion was producing visible difficulties. The 3 new offices had been announced, but only one opened. The federal bid was stalled. A major client whose contract had been up for renewal had gone quiet in a way that felt significant. I knew these things not because I was monitoring Okafor obsessively, but because the construction industry in Lagos is not large, and information moves through it the way weather moves. You feel it before you can explain where it came from. I was paying attention to everything. In the 7th month, Balogun placed a folder on the table between us. A contact on the board of a development fund had shared something he thought I should see. Inside were financial summaries, not confidential, but publicly filed reports that anyone could obtain if they knew where to look. The picture they told was precise. Okafor Construction had taken a significant bridging loan to fund the expansion. The loan was tied to the federal contract coming through. With a bit stalled, the repayment schedule was creating pressure the company's operating cash flow could not comfortably absorb. One long-standing credit line was carrying a balance it had not carried in 3 previous years. None of it was hidden. It was simply the consequence of aggressive expansion without adequate reserves, exactly what I had described in the meeting where I was told I was being overly cautious. I sat with the folder for a long time. I had a decision to make, not about whether to act, but about how. Whether to use this information as a weapon or as a map. I chose to treat it as a map. Maps show you where you are. Weapons only show you where you want to go. By the 8th month, 3 former Okafor employees had reached out to me independently. A quantity surveyor named Adiz, who had worked under me on 2 projects. A site engineer named Femi, whose judgment I had always trusted. A project coordinator named Obiora, who had been with Okafor 11 years and who told me, when we met for coffee, that morale inside the company had changed significantly since the expansion announcement. He described meetings where technical concerns were raised and dismissed, decisions made without adequate consultation, a growing gap between what was said publicly and what people inside understood to be true. I listened carefully to each of them. I did not recruit them aggressively or make promises I could not keep. I told each one honestly what Solid Base was and what it might become. I said that if the time came when they wanted to make a change, I would welcome a conversation. I said it once. Adiz joined Solid Base in the 9th month. Femi joined in the 10th. Obiora called 6 weeks after our coffee meeting. "I've been thinking," he said. I told him to come in whenever he was ready. By month 8, I had a small team, people who had chosen me because of what they had observed. The public mistake arrived in month 9. A major client whose projects Okafor had managed for 7 years shared images on their company page showing structural defects in a recently completed retaining wall. They did not name the contractor initially, but people in the industry knew. The post attracted engineers, developers, and journalists. Within 48 hours, 2 news outlets had run stories. Okafor's name appeared in both. I did not comment publicly. I did not share the articles or respond to knowing messages people sent me. What I noticed was that within a week, 2 developers in conversations with Okafor went quiet. One expressed interest, through a mutual contact, in speaking with me. I met him on a Thursday morning. He had done his research. He asked about Solid Base's quality controls, site management process, structural inspection approach. He asked about our residential project, which had been completed and reviewed positively by an independent assessor. We spoke for 90 minutes. Before he left, he said he would be in touch within 2 weeks. He called in 11 days. He said he had checked our project records and spoken with 2 subcontractors. They had said I was the person who came to the site personally when something went wrong. He said that was exactly what he was looking for. Solid Base signed its largest contract in month 10. A mixed-use development in Abuja, commercial ground floor, residential above, a scope that a year earlier would have been beyond what I could have attempted.
It was not beyond me now.
I had Adiz, Femi, and Obiora. I had a supplier network built quietly over 9 months. I had a track record, small but clean, no disputes, no delays, no defects. The developer had come to me specifically because of the retaining wall story. He had watched what happened at Okafor and asked himself what the alternative was. I do not say this with satisfaction at Okafor's difficulties. The difficulties were foreseeable and preventable. My father had chosen not to prevent them. That was his decision, and he would live with its consequences. My work was to build something that deserved the trust being placed in it. The Abuja contract required 6 additional site staff and 2 office coordinators. I spent 3 weeks selecting them carefully. I paid them properly. I told each of them directly what the company stood for. I had heard that you don't build a company. You build the people, and the people build the company. Chidi made his last real move in month 11. By this point, Solid Base was visible enough that avoiding it required deliberate effort. He contacted 3 of my current clients. 2 told me directly. The 3rd I inferred from a sudden coolness that warmed again when I asked directly. His message appeared to be the same thing he had tried with my suppliers months earlier. Vague implications, unnamed concerns, suggestions of legal risk. It performed even worse the 2nd time. One client told him they had reviewed our contract terms and site records and had no concerns. Another asked him to put his specific concern in writing. He did not follow up. Desperation changes how things smell. Chitty's moves had the quality of a person watching something drift in a direction they had not prepared for. I had a brief moment of something, not pleasure exactly, but a clean recognition that the structure was holding. Then I went back to reviewing the Abuja project timeline. There was a drainage specification I wanted to reconsider before we broke ground. The work was always more important than the drama surrounding it. I had learned this early, and I held on to it deliberately, especially when the drama was loudest. My father called me in month 12 from a number I did not recognize. When I heard his voice, I needed a moment to arrange myself.
He asked how I was. I said I was well.
He said he had heard I was doing interesting work. I said it was going well. He did not mention Okafor directly. He did not mention Chitty. He did not acknowledge the boardroom, or the manner of it, or the 11 people who had been present. What he said, in the careful language of a man not accustomed to uncertainty, was that perhaps it was time to sit down and talk. He said family was family. I listened to all of it without argument. I said I appreciated him calling, and that I would think about it. I ended the call and sat very still. The warmth in his voice was real in the sense that he was genuinely trying. But underneath the warmth, I could hear what had actually driven the call. It was not guilt. It was not a late recognition of what the boardroom had done to me. It was the sound of a man who could now see clearly that the person he had removed was not, in fact, finished. By month 13, the geometry of the situation had shifted in ways no longer invisible. Solid Base held 3 active contracts and 2 more in late-stage negotiation. Our reputation in the construction corridor was growing without press releases, purely on the basis of finished work. The federal contract bid at the center of my father's expansion was officially withdrawn. Okafor had not satisfied the qualification review. The bridging loan Balogun had identified was now a visible item in industry conversations. 2 of the 3 new offices had been quietly closed. The third was being repositioned as a liaison office. The client whose retaining wall photographs had triggered press coverage had formally moved their next project to a different contractor. I had not done any of this. I had simply built Solid Base correctly, and the contrast had done the rest. My father's call had not been the only sign. 2 board-level contacts at Okafor had reached out through intermediaries, asking what I was planning. One of them was the consultant who had first called me about the federal bid stall. He was no longer being subtle. He wanted to know whether there was another option.
I had not yet said.
But I was beginning to see the shape of it. My father requested a meeting in month 14. He suggested his office. I suggested a restaurant. Neutral ground where neither of us sat behind a desk implying authority. He agreed, which was itself a small sign. He arrived before me. He stood when he saw me, which he had not done at the boardroom meeting. We sat. He ordered water. I ordered tea. He began talking almost immediately about the company's challenges, the difficulties of the expansion, personnel issues he had been navigating. I listened. I did not lean forward with eagerness or remind him I had predicted the difficulties he was describing. I simply listened, hands around my teacup, face neutral and present. About 20 minutes in, he arrived at the real purpose. He said there had perhaps been some mistakes. That Chitty had been given more authority than was wise. He said, carefully, without saying it directly, that he wondered if there was a role for me back at Okafor. I let the question sit in the air. Then I said I would need to think carefully about that. I meant it literally. I did not know yet what the right answer looked like. The second meeting happened 3 weeks later. My father arrived with a folder and specific numbers, a proposed arrangement placing me back at Okafor in a senior role with significant Abuja responsibility. On the surface, a generous offer. But as I read through the folder, I noticed what it did not contain. It did not address the share question, the shares my mother had left me, the charter clause I had identified. It did not acknowledge the boardroom meeting or that it had been handled incorrectly. It placed me back inside a structure my father still controlled, solving problems he had created, under terms he had determined. His tone as he walked me through the document had a quality I recognized, patience performed, warmth that was real, but was the warmth of a man who needed something. Halfway through, I watched the effort it was costing him to remain calm. I saw the moment it stopped being worth the effort. "You understand what I'm offering you," he said. His voice had changed. The sentence was not a question. It was a statement expecting confirmation. He was still, underneath everything, waiting for the nod he had always received. I said what I had come to say. My voice was level. "I understand exactly what you're offering, and I need you to understand something in return." I told him about the shares. Not as a threat, as information. The fact of them, the charter clause, the formal accounting request I had the right to make and had not yet made. I watched his face as I spoke. The surprise was real. He had not known I had identified the shares or read the charter that carefully. He had assumed the quiet member of the family was also the uninformed one. I told him I was not coming back to Okafor in a role he had designed. I told him that Solid Base was not a temporary inconvenience that would dissolve with an attractive offer. I told him that if he wanted a genuine conversation about the company's future, I was willing, but it would need to be different from the one he had prepared for. He stared at me for a long moment. It was the look of a man discovering that the board he thought he was playing on was larger than he had realized. He set his folder down. He said he would need some time to think. I said that was fine. The formal accounting request arrived at Okafor's registered address on a Monday morning in month 15. Balogun's lawyer had drafted it. The legal language was precise. It cited the charter clause by number and listed the specific decisions requiring formal accounting: the boardroom removal, the expansion financing structure, the withdrawn federal bid, and the retaining wall project whose defects had been reported in the press. Copies went to every listed director. My father called within 2 hours. His voice had changed again. The performance was gone. What was left was something older, not anger, but the sound of a man who had built something over decades and was now being asked to account for it by someone he had not expected to be capable of this. I let him speak. When he finished, I said, "I am not trying to take the company from you. I am asking you to run it correctly. And I am asking to be included, not as a favor, not as a subordinate, but as a shareholder." The silence lasted a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. He said he would call the board together. He said it would take a few weeks. I said I would be there. I meant it. The board meeting lasted 4 hours. The formal accounting process did what such processes are designed to do. It required documentation, explanation, and that decisions made privately be presented somewhere they could withstand examination. Chitty was present. The retaining wall documentation was reviewed. The expansion financing was reviewed. The federal bid withdrawal was reviewed. At each stage, the gap between what had been publicly announced and what had actually happened became visible in the room. I did not attack anyone. I asked questions. I presented the analysis I had been building since the day I left the parking lot 15 months earlier, methodical, sourced, unemotional. By the time we reached the final agenda item, 3 of the 5 non-family board members had asked questions Chitty could not adequately answer. The consultant who had first called me about the bid stall caught my eye across the table once. He said nothing.
He did not need to.
The structure of the room had already spoken. My father sat at the head of the table and was quieter than I had ever seen him in a professional setting. He was not defeated. He was finally listening. That was what I had wanted more than any legal outcome. To be heard in that room. 6 months after the board meeting, Solid Base merged with Okafor Construction under terms negotiated over 8 weeks. My father remained chairman. Chitty remained a director with a significantly reduced portfolio. What changed was the structure, the governance, the decision-making process, the financial controls that would prevent a repetition of the expansion disaster. And what changed most was my position inside that structure. Not as a favor. Not as a return to something taken from me. As a shareholder exercising rights that had always been mine, in a role earned through 15 months of building something that stood on its own. My father and I have not had a warm reconciliation.
That is not what the story is about.
What we have is a working relationship built on something that did not exist before, mutual knowledge of what the other is capable of, respect that was not given but demonstrated. On the day the merger documents were signed, I drove past the parking lot where I had sat for 40 minutes 15 months earlier. I did not stop. There was nothing left to process there. The work had done the processing. The work had always been the answer.